In this video, you will get both a quantitative and qualitative perspective of campus climate and culture from our students. Using findings from the DLE and scientific psychological literature, we conducted student interviews to supplement our quantitative DLE findings. We used the multi-contextual model of diverse learning environments created from researchers out of the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA to tell a story about our LGBTQ+ students' experiences at Delta. Earlier in this presentation, Kirsten gave you a historical account of our LGBTQ+ students' experiences and touched base on a very important law, AB 620. AB 620 states that colleges should be including sexual orientation and gender identity on any new form of data collection that will disaggregate groups. This video will show you why including these disaggregations are important. Without further ado, please meet our wonderful student panel.
My name is Atlas Rivera. I go by they, them pronouns.
Hi, I'm Isaiah Merriweather, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
My name is James Patnod, and my pronouns are he or they.
In the following section of this video, I will give you a quantitative summary of the following dimensions of campus climate: civic engagement, administrative response to diversity issues, sense of belonging, safety, bias, harassment and discrimination, and validation, both academic and interpersonal. After I give these quantitative summaries, you will hear a qualitative perspective from our student panel. The first variable that we will examine is civic engagement. The Higher Education Research Institute, also known as HARRY, out of UCLA, provided us with data comparing Delta College to other institutions across the nation. It is important to note that the analyses from HARRY compare only full-time students to reduce possible confounds between students at different types of institutions. The DLE is administered at many colleges across the nation, and it includes four-year universities and community colleges. Compared to the other colleges, Delta students are less civically engaged. However, our genderqueer, and for the purpose of these analyses, that includes non-binary and gender non-conforming students, are more civically engaged than the other groups at Delta, though they are not as engaged as genderqueer students from other colleges. This may be because historically four-year universities have been more inclusive of the LGBTQ+ community. They have had multicultural and pride centers for years, while community colleges have only recently begun to create these types of centers for students. Analyses I conducted included a focus on Delta students. These analyses include all of our LGBTQ+ students, not just full-time students. As we can see here, queer students reported more civic engagement than straight students. Non-binary, genderqueer, and gender non-conforming students reported more civic engagement than cisgender students.
I was the treasurer for Delta Pride Club. We would table a lot, and we would just be out there like showing that, hey, we're a big part of the on-campus community, like, and just spreading like knowledge and all that.
I helped advocate for gender-neutral restrooms on campus. We do have some right now. However, there needs to be more, at least one in each building, on one each floor, possibly, so that someone would not have to go across campus just to use the restroom, just so that they can feel safe. I helped advocate for the preferred name on the roll sheets.
I was part of the fight to improve the process to change names on campus. I don't want to say I was like the reason for it, but like once my whole name change debacle happened, like I was ready to fight someone, so we really gunned for that. I've also just tried to support any and all events that Delta Pride has put on. If I could be there, I'd be there. I'd be out tabling, handing out flyers. If we're protesting, like, the religious protesters that are harassing students on campus, like, I was out there as well, helping with that. I mean, on top of working at the County Pride Center, we offer our support as well, to the best of our ability. So it's hard to say what that looks like, but we try.
To understand how students view our administration, the DLE asked the question, "This college has campus administrators who regularly speak about the value of diversity." I disaggregated this question by all of our typical demographic groups and discovered that asexual and queer students had the highest disagreement of any demographic group. They were between 7.6 and 9.5% less likely than the average student to say Delta has campus administrators who regularly speak about the value of diversity.
There wasn't a lot of support when it came to administrators, because there were moments where the Pride Center was very packed and it was in a small room, and so there were multiple times where we would address this to administrators and we would just get ignored. We had to basically get everybody that would show up to the center to sit inside the room and invite the dean to come in and see, this is a safety hazard, we need a bigger room. Please acknowledge us.
Helped advocate for a larger space for the Delta Pride Center, because there was a growing community, but however we were confined, and it's honestly kind of a malicious act to deny the space of growth for the students at Delta, because people loved coming to the center. They felt like they can freely be there. They study, they listen to music, they're able to converse and really grow in self-actualization, which is one aspect of which college is about.
So the Delta Pride administrators and those who support Delta Pride have been phenomenal at trying to support our students that go through the doors. But when it comes down to trying to get a bigger room for us to be able to study in relative comfort and not be packed in like a bunch of sardines, breaking fire code when it's that busy in there, or even just streamlining the process to have your name changed within the records at Delta, it's definitely lacking. Is that my name on my student email had never been changed even after my name change. So I sent an email to a professor, and in the subject it had my full old name on it. And I just dropped the class after that because I didn't want to have to deal with explaining who I was. I didn't want to have to deal with that, so I just ended up dropping the class. But there was no apology for it. It was just, I had to climb the ladder to reach somebody who was willing to do something about it.
Sense of belonging shows up as an important variable across the scientific literature, correlating with better student outcomes, such as college completion. Overall, Delta students have a slightly higher sense of belonging than other colleges around the nation. However, genderqueer students have less sense of belonging than these other groups. A comparison of LGBTQ+ students from the DLE we administered in 2016 versus 2021 shows the prevalence of disagreement. A substantial amount of our LGBTQ+ students disagree they feel a sense of belonging. In 2016, between a quarter to over half of our LGBT students disagreed they felt a sense of belonging to Delta. In 2021, those percentages were similar overall, with the caveat that some individual groups fluctuated up or down. This may be because labels changed both within the LGBTQ+ community and in the way they were asked on the DLE. Many more students started identifying as queer in 2021. Queer went from the smallest group in 2016 sample to one of the larger groups in the 2021 sample. The 2016 DLE did not ask about non-binary students. However, in 2021, we can see that 42.9% of non-binary students disagreed they have a sense of belonging to campus.
It's very easy to come onto campus. It's probably not as easy to think that you belong there. Student-led clubs and organizations, that's where you can find, a place where you can really mesh with and find people that you really like get along with. That's where I would say where the belongingness would be.
I do get a sense of belonging from like the students at like the Pride Center, the Pride Center's like faculty staff, but majority of the teachers and staff, I don't really get a sense of belonging. I feel like I'm just basically a number for their system kind of thing.
The only time I've ever felt like I belonged was when I was in the Pride room, but when it comes to being involved in my classwork within, the lecture or in groups in class, I've never felt like I belonged.
Definitely a lot more like engagement with the students, more certain like courses aimed for like different cultures, different like gender study would be great, like more LGBT like history stuff. That would be great. That would make me feel like more involved.
If they could incorporate more cultural aspects onto campus and have it more welcoming, that would be very nice. I know it's hard, especially during COVID. But Delta College is in the most diverse city in America at the moment, and that's reflected into the population, as you're no doubt aware. That's just one thing they can do, is just incorporate a little bit more. I feel like they're trying, but really keep your eyes open and keep your ears open to those who are like speaking, okay? Especially from those from marginalized communities. And also a good way is to observe certain days, like, for example, LGBT Awareness Day, TDOV, which is coming up, which is Trans Day of Visibility. I would suggest that they really read upon certain issues and challenges, as well as really look at what the LGBT community really goes through. It's not a catch-all. I understand it's not going to be easy, but one good way to learn about it is to visit your local like LGBT center, or better yet, engage with some students and an LGBT center on campus as well to really learn more. And not just to send one representative for it, but rather as many people as they can.
I think providing more support, not only to the Pride Center, but also just facilitating student-led organizations in general, because Delta Pride was actually one of the only reasons why I stayed on campus, because otherwise I was just going to go 100% online for the longest time, because I did not feel safe on campus. So providing that ability to have students find community is a huge, huge part of going to college, and even just developing an identity as a person.
Transgender, asexual, and queer students feel less safe on campus than their straight and cisgender peers. Nearly a quarter of queer and trans students feel unsafe on campus.
We feel attacked here. We don't feel safe on campus.
Even like being anywhere else on campus, there's always that lingering fear of like, I gotta watch my back because I don't know if somebody's gonna spot me and just be like, act some certain kind of way. When it comes to even just using bathrooms on campus, for the longest time when I started at Delta, there was only one gender neutral restroom on campus, and that was underneath the forums down like this scary hallway. And I mean, half the time they were locked for like no reason. So it didn't feel safe for me to even use the freaking bathroom. Eventually that was changed and there were others added across campus, but like there was one in Shima somewhere, I think downstairs, that was flat out unsafe to use because people were constantly defacing the posters that were in the bathroom. They were kicking students out that didn't look like they belonged there. And when I say they, I mean other students that are using it, because this used to be a men's restroom and it was still being treated and used like it was a men's restroom. So it was not safe to use. And I'm sure that alone would scare off a lot of trans students, especially those who aren't transitioned at all or might not want to for various reasons. It doesn't facilitate that sense of safety and belonging.
In 2016, Delta LGBTQ+ students experienced many forms of bias, harassment, and discrimination. The most common form of discrimination was verbal comments. Nearly 60% of transgender students personally experienced discriminatory verbal comments since entering Delta. More than a half of gay students and nearly half of bisexual, pansexual, and asexual plus students experienced discriminatory verbal comments. 1 in 4 transgender, pansexual, and asexual plus students, and 1 in 5 gay, lesbian, and bisexual students experienced discriminatory written comments. Between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 LGBTQ+ students experienced exclusion. Many LGBTQ+ students also experienced offensive visual images, threats of physical violence, physical assaults or injuries, anonymous phone calls, and damage to personal property. Strikingly, nearly 1 in 5 gay students experienced physical assault and damage to personal property while on campus. This begs the question, are all these incidents being reported? Do students know who their AB620 point person is to report these types of occurrences? Where can students find this information? Is it easily located? In 2021, we saw decreases in all these forms of discrimination in nearly every group. However, a simple explanation for this has to do with the wording of the questions. The questions explicitly state, please indicate how often you have personally experienced the following forms of bias, harassment, discrimination at this college. Since we administered the DLE in 2021, while we were fully remote due to COVID-19, many students had never been on campus. For many students, their entire education had been online. Even though many students had never been on campus in person, skewing comparisons to 2016, many students still reported experiencing multiple forms of discrimination at Delta. Nearly 40% of genderqueer and gender nonconforming students experienced discriminatory verbal comments. Again, it is important to note that LGBTQ+ groupings changed on the DLE in 2021. Genderqueer students were not included on the DLE administered in 2016, and given that they are the group reporting the greatest frequency of discrimination in multiple areas, it denotes why disaggregating for this group is important. Though these percentages are smaller than the percentages reported in 2016, we should not pat ourselves on the back. Nearly 1 in 5 non-binary and queer students, and more than 1 in 5 asexual students, reported experiencing exclusion. Sadly, nearly 1 in 5 non-binary students still experienced damage to their personal property at Delta. Digging deeper into discrimination, it is important to understand the role intersectionality plays. Our LGBTQ+ students not only experience high rates of gender identity and sexual orientation discrimination, they also experience high rates of discrimination based on their ability, disability, age, citizenship status, political beliefs, race and ethnicity, spiritual beliefs, and socioeconomic status. The additional areas of discrimination based on multiple of their identities overlap, and it has a devastating impact on their academic outcomes. At Delta, only 5% of LGBTQ+ students pass a transfer math course in their first year. The discrimination they face, especially the intersectional discrimination they face, impacts the very outcomes that we are trying to improve, such as AB 705. All community colleges are working tirelessly to improve completion rates. Maybe we need to work smarter, not harder. If we mitigate the discrimination students experience, we ultimately improve academic outcomes. In this graph, the most striking piece of data is the amount of sexual orientation discrimination gay students endure. 37.1% experienced discrimination for being gay. Additionally, 20.6% of our gay students also experienced racial discrimination, and 14.3% experienced ability-disability discrimination. Students that were lumped as other in 2016, which I relabeled pansexual, asexual plus, reported high rates of discrimination across all intersections. This further denotes why disaggregating LGBTQ+ students and not lumping them all into one category is important. In 2021, intersectionality discrimination did not follow the same decreased trend that we saw in the previous graphs. This further supports the argument I made earlier stating that discrimination was less frequent in 2021, not because discrimination decreased, but because students were not on campus to actually experience it. In many cases, discrimination increased in 2021. This graph shows us the prevalence of intersectional discrimination. For example, in 2016, only 13.3% of transgender students reported discrimination based on their race ethnicity. However, in 2021, that number rose 20 percentage points higher to 33.3%. Intersectional discrimination for non-binary, genderqueer, and gender nonconforming students are sizable. Without disaggregating by these groups, we would never have learned that an equal amount of non-binary students experience gender identity discrimination and racial discrimination. As educators, we have rightfully placed much emphasis on racial and ethnic disparities. These graphs show us that while that is a good starting place, it is simply an incomplete picture. We need to start disaggregating student data by intersecting identities, because these are our most vulnerable students and the ones where interventions could have the greatest impact. These students are experiencing discrimination on multiple fronts, and for the most part, they are completely overlooked in our analyses. In 2016, the DLE asked students if they experienced discrimination in a categorical yes-no sense. In 2021, the DLE switched to a Likert format that included the options never, sometimes, often, and very often. This enabled us to examine which types of intersectional discrimination happen most frequently within the LGBTQ+ community. While there are differences within the LGBTQ+ community, overall, LGBTQ+ students reported experiencing discrimination based on ability disability status most often. 15.4% of genderqueer and gender nonconforming and 13.3% of transgender students reported experiencing discrimination based on their ability disability status, often or very often. Gender identity, race ethnicity, and sexual orientation were also frequent forms of discrimination. 11.5% of non-binary students reported experiencing intersectional discrimination often or very often based on their sexual orientation, while 16% of queer students reported experiencing racial discrimination often or very often.
Don't discriminate.
I would like for them to know mainly about intersectionality. Like, for instance, I am Black and I'm bisexual. It's going to be difficult to find a place on campus for me that isn't the Pride Center because of certain caveats. Like how I said, I am both Black and bisexual in the Black community, and there are Black organizations on campus. In the Black community, we're typically raised to be, for men to be like very macho, and I consider myself a little bit more feminine. And there were times in the resource center, there was an incident in which there was a Delta organization on campus, predominantly Black, but there have been a few microaggressions. I dropped off some flyers at a certain organization on campus in their office. And I was told from another student that after I left, all the flyers were thrown into the garbage. However, having a space like the Pride Center can really, it's a safe space for me to be me. I didn't let that stop me from becoming still part of that organization on Delta. However, I wish that administration would understand that intersectionality, that there still needs to be a safe space.
Pronouns, names, like I've had friends who have had teachers, they would tell them their pronouns or their names and they would just ignore it.
It was my first day of class ever, and I'd spent that whole week leading up to it trying to work with the admissions office and stuff to get my name changed on all of my paperwork because I was in the middle of my name change. And for whatever reason, even though I started class the day before I would legally have my name changed, they still required me to have my old name on everything. They said that they were going to email my professor to update the roll sheets to have my actual name on it. I don't think that happened because the day came for class, I showed up, and my professor called roll with my old name. And this was a packed forum class. So that, it wasn't a malicious incident, but the fact that it happened after I did everything I could to prevent that from happening, it still happened. And then leaving that classroom, I went out into the quad, and there's this preacher guy out there harassing students, screaming about how gays are going to hell. So I almost dropped my class that day because I did not feel safe.
Sometimes people who are not affiliated with the campus, not a student, have really no reason to be there, sometimes come onto campus and they pronounce hate speech and discrimination on campus. A couple years ago, a certain preacher came onto campus, and he was pointing at students, harassing students with a big sign that said, so many people are going, so such and such are going to hell. They were LGBT, bisexual, but also some really funny things like sports nuts. Like, apparently if you like sports, you're going to go to hell. I know, you can't argue, it's ridiculous. But he would occasionally point out to people. He even pointed out to one student that said, Muslim, you're going to die, because they appear to be Middle Eastern or South Asian descent. So inaccurate and racist and very hateful. As it turns out, he can come onto campus because Delta is technically a public space where there's public speech, but apparently the line between public speech and hate speech is so fine that apparently nothing can be done about it. We're all aware that Delta has a zero tolerance policy to discrimination. However, when things like that happen, it's really hard to believe that. I, as a student that day, felt very threatened. You know, we come to campus to learn. We don't come here to be harassed.
There is a lot of lack of knowledge, I would say. Like, just people will say, like, wrong things. And like, the thing is, though, like, I'll correct them, or someone will correct them, and they'll just keep saying there's a lack of wanting to learn. And a lot of the times, the gender-neutral restrooms are very neglected. There are many times when someone would go use the gender-neutral restroom, and the locks are always broken. They were oftentimes, like, vandalized. They would have, like, slurs written on them, or just, like, general graffiti and stuff. Particularly, like, one time I used the restroom, I would just get, someone else walked in, and I would just get weird stares. And it's like, I'm just using the restroom. Please ignore me.
There's next to no visibility on campus, and it doesn't seem like there's any effort to improve that, except by students' efforts and those who are trying to support us. Everybody else just says that Delta's hands are tied about it. So I've completely transitioned all of my classes to online. Just in between the risk of catching COVID on campus, it's just easier. It's easier to avoid putting myself in an unsafe situation and have to deal with just the casual and sometimes blatant transphobia and homophobia on campus, and just the ignorance. It gets so tiring. At least when I'm online, I don't have to deal with people face to face. So it's not super great.
These charts from Harry show that Delta students receive similar levels of academic validation as students from other colleges. However, when it comes to interpersonal validation, Delta students reported less interpersonal validation than other colleges. genderqueer, gender nonconforming, and non-binary students at Delta reported less interpersonal validation than the average student, even though at other colleges, genderqueer students actually reported higher levels of interpersonal validation. This begs the questions: why are genderqueer students receiving less interpersonal validation than our average student at Delta? Digging deeper into interpersonal validation, we see that in 2016, the biggest disagreement within the LGBTQ+ community comes from staff encouraging students to get involved in campus activities. Between a quarter and over a half of LGBTQ+ students disagreed that staff encouraged them to get involved. And between 1 in 5 to over a third of LGBTQ+ students disagree that at least one faculty member has taken an interest in their development. In 2021, we see similar levels of disagreement as we saw in 2016. In some cases, disagreement actually increased. These graphs show that Delta's faculty and staff can do a much better job at encouraging, empowering, and taking an interest in our students. Something as simple as just believing in a student's ability to succeed academically can make a world of difference for students. Yet many faculty and staff blame students for being unprepared for college.
I think the only time I ever had an affirming professor up until this point was my sociology professor. And he went out of his way to be an ally. So, I mean, he was fantastic, but I've had like other professors where it's not necessarily a hostile environment, but it's not welcoming either. Trying to reach a counselor at Delta to discuss career options or degree options, it's worse than pulling teeth. I was once on the wait list for like 2 months to reach an academic counselor, and I got somebody who changed my degree to business, and I did not want to pursue business, but then I was just stuck with it until I could reach somebody else.
To show like, hey, we see you, we know you're here, and we want to acknowledge you. I just think like acknowledgement is like a really big thing when it comes to the LGBTQ community, because for so many years we were kind of just pushed aside. We were like, okay, you're fine to do that, don't show us, that kind of thing. And it's tough because you're kind of just told like, we don't like you as a person and we don't want to see you. So just having events where it allows us to be visible would be great.
No. I feel like they're doing okay given the circumstances of COVID. I think last time I was on campus, like there was like a flyer for like a drum circle kind of thing, and I was like, well, okay, that's pretty cool. Just really to stand with the students and say like, hey, it's okay to be you here, be yourself, and you'll be able to grow here. You are welcome and you will be safe here on campus. That really means a lot, to really stand with us.